Good evening. From Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in the Gail Lemron Auditorium here on campus, welcome to the President Speaker Series. On behalf of President John P. Johnson, I'm Marc Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. In the first of the two final events for our fall series, we're going to talk about something that is known to historians but has never been quite described in the manner you're going to hear. The Nuremberg trials, the trials of the Nazis who committed the worst atrocities upon other citizens of the earth, particularly their persecution of Jewish people. But there was a mission to send chaplains to work with these people before they were tried, and many of them eventually hung. Some tried to take their own lives. Some were successful. The man who is in this book, the story that comes out of originally St. Louis, is featured in this book, Mission at Nuremberg. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to give a warm Embry-Riddle welcome for the author of the book, Mission at Nuremberg, Tim Townsend. Tim, thanks for being with us tonight to talk about this incredible story. It comes as a result from your work at St. Louis, at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It's interesting that the man who is at the center of this story is from St. Louis. How did you find this?
Yeah, it was one of those miracles of newspaper reporting. I was the religion reporter at the Post-Dispatch for a long time, almost 10 years. About, I think it was 2007, newspaper reporters, depending on the size of your paper, I guess, the editors of papers ask for from their reporters around the holidays evergreen stories. They want stories. They know people are going to be out of the newsroom on vacation, and they ask you to come up with sort of feature-y stories that they can run anytime during the holidays. So I found one of those. I found a story about a program that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is the second largest Lutheran community in the country, they were running a new program to try to reintegrate chaplains coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq to sort of better meld them back into their congregations when they got home. So that was the story. And I did a little bit of reporting, and I realized I needed some color for it. So I went to the local Lutheran seminary. They happened to have an exhibit at the time on the history of military chaplaincy in the United States. And there, under one of the pieces of glass, was a letter that was written, signed by all 21 of the major Nazi war criminals, to the wife of Henry Gerecke, who's the main character in this book. It was written about halfway through the trials, and the Nazis had heard a rumor that Alma Gerecke, Henry Gerecke's wife, had had enough. She wanted him to come home. He'd been at war for 3 years. She hadn't seen him for that long. The war was over, and she wanted him to come home. So they were writing a letter to a St. Louis housewife. This is everybody from Hitler's number 2, Hermann Göring, all the way down.
He signed that letter.
All of them signed it, whether he was their official minister or not, begging her to allow this man to stay through the end of the trials. And when I was reading this, I thought, that I've never heard that story before. But the remarkable thing to me was about halfway through this fairly short letter, the Nazis said to Alma something like, we surely need not tell his own wife what an extraordinary man he is. We have simply come to love him. And it's signed by the architects of the Holocaust. So naturally, as a reporter, I thought, I'm going to file this story and then figure out what that one is.
Well, now we're going to back up now. His name is pronounced like Gerecke, correct? Now, he was a Lutheran minister, and he had ascended into the military, but he came in his 40s, right? He wasn't a young man.
He was almost 50, yeah. He had spent most of his life, he got into the ministry fairly late, only because he was brought up on a farm in southeast Missouri. His father did not want him to be a minister, so he waited until he was old enough to leave the house legally to almost go back to high school and then college and then seminary. So he was fairly old in his 20s before he became a minister in St. Louis. He did that for probably 10 years, and right in the middle of the Depression, decided he was a little bit bored with congregational life, and picked up his family, they lived in a nice vicarage in the middle of St. Louis. Everything was paid for. Decided that he wanted to start a mission in the streets of St. Louis, trying to help people who were struggling, obviously, during the Depression. So he did that for another. He was the executive missioner of the St. Louis Lutheran City Mission for almost another 10 years. And that's when he decides, after 2 of his sons are already in the war, that right before he turns 50, he's going to raise his hand and volunteer to be a chaplain.
Now, in putting this book together, you were able to talk with his son, Hank.
Yes, exactly. It was the first thing I did after I left, found the story in the seminary. I found Hank, and I went down immediately, I think that weekend, to his house. Lives still in the same community in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where his father grew up. So yeah, I went down and sat at his kitchen table, and he told me the story about his dad, and it sort of rolled from there.
A little bit on the background. In reading this book, I find there are unusual personality quirks with these 2 people, the husband and wife. I don't know whether she didn't trust him or what, but is he a gregarious, flirtatious guy because she's worried about other women? And there's no indication in this book that he ever stepped out on her, but she keeps him on a short leash. Correct?
I think that's a good way to put it, yeah. I mean, they had very different personalities. It's definitely sort of the opposites attract variety of relationship.
Yeah.
He was very gregarious, very flirtatious, and sort of bounded into the room kind of guy. And he was also sort of dumpy and small.
Yeah,
and
that's why I'm thinking, what's she worried about?
And he did not care about money. It didn't matter to him. He was sort of this social justice evangelical before anybody knew what that was. And she, Alma, was very much the opposite. His family in the south of Missouri called her the flapper because she was from the city. She loved furs and cars, and he called her Speaker of the House. That was his nickname for her.
So he buys her a car, and as I recall, he's away for a while. And he was going to give the car or let somebody drive the car while he was away, and she goes, oh, no, you don't. Sell the car, give me the money. I want to buy a fur coat or something?
Yeah.
So that really happened?
Somebody in the congregation donated this old car to the family. They didn't have any money, and so people would donate a lot of things to them. They had this car, and while he was at war, it was in the middle, I think it was in 1944 or so, he wanted somebody driving the car because, it needed to be driven. She didn't know how to drive, and so he was going to have the car driven around by somebody from the congregation who he knew, and she thought it was horrible that another woman was going to be driving their car around town. And so she didn't tell him anything. She just sold it to somebody, bought herself a fur, and sent him half of the car money in Europe.
Well, what's he going to do with that?
He was apparently furious.
Yeah. So, and he wanted to do whatever he could to keep her happy. But I couldn't help but think, as I'm reading this, he's away for years. Maybe he wanted to be away from her.
They had a very, very, even though they were very different people, they had an extremely close relationship. And their son, Hank, when Henry met Alma, she was a department store clerk in St. Louis, and their kids always called it Dad's Waterloo, when he met her. And she had these huge brown eyes, and she was beautiful. And they were an odd but extremely close, loving couple.
The kids are interesting too. Not that there's a lot of writing in this, but they pick up these vibes between the parents. And he says something, and she's going to react, and the kids see it, and they're like, well, it's going to really hit the fan now,
There's a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah. So he's overseas. What I'm wondering is, will readers also draw, the atrocities are mentioned, we're going to get to that. The Japanese end their conflict. They surrender months later, September 2nd, signing on board a ship. Are there trials that are like Nuremberg for the Japanese, separately being conducted at the same time?
There were war trials, yeah. The Nuremberg trials came first. You can't quote me on this. I know we're on the radio. But the Japanese trials were similar, modeled on the Nuremberg trials, but came afterwards. So they were happening. The Nuremberg trials, the trial of the major war criminals that I write about in the book, that's the first and the biggest of the Nuremberg trials. But the Nuremberg trials went on for years. Other waves of criminals were judged by the Allies.
On the far left, you see the row of the people with the helmets. For those who are watching this later, Goering is on the left with the headset. And if you could draw a little cloud like they do in the comics, the words would be, yeah, you know. Because that's what it looks like. He was disengaged. But we learn a lot about Goering. He had an incredible love for his wife, but he doesn't come to Christ despite the amount of times that Gerecke asked him because he's going to die. So we learn in reading this that after the last meeting between Gerecke, as he tries to minister to these people, to get them to somehow ask for forgiveness and before they're put to death, he ends up killing himself. Here's the question I have. Will readers deduce when they look at this book that the guards knew that Goering had the cyanide, I think he used cyanide, correct, in glass? Did they know he had it and they looked the other way, or did he really pull it over on them?
There's an amazing book that was written maybe 20 years ago by a Texas, I think he was, I'm not sure that he was a professor, but he might have been a school teacher. He was just clearly somebody who was obsessed with that topic. And he did more research than I've ever read on this subject. He concluded at the end of his book that there was one guard who took a shine to Goering. Goering was very popular in the prison at Nuremberg. He was a very charming guy. I mean, there was no question about it. People who went in hating him ended up thinking, you know, like of two minds. How can you really think that person is funny and witty when you know what he was responsible for during the war? But nevertheless, he was a great conversationalist. He was interested in baseball. He talked to the both chaplains about baseball. Thought maybe he should get into that business at one point.
Missed an opportunity.
Yeah, but so there was one guard who this author figures out was the guard who probably went into Goering's luggage, which was still in a sort of another cell. They kept all of the luggage, all the stuff that all these 21 Nazis brought was just stuffed into a closet, essentially, in the prison. Probably at some point went in, found the cyanide where Goering told him it was, snuck it in. Goering hid that under the lip in the toilet seat, which is, they think, how he hid it for so long, transferring it from here and there. But he probably only had it for the last week or two before he used it.
Did they think that he came in with it or somebody snuck it to him?
No, they think that he came in with it in his luggage. Somehow it was maybe, I don't know, in the binding or something of his luggage. And this guard, Tex Wheeler, made some deal with him. Maybe he just liked him. Maybe he was promised something somehow through an attorney. He went in, took the cyanide out of the luggage, somehow got it to Goering, and he used it.
For our listeners and viewers, when you read this book, and I really hope everyone does read it, you're going to be at some point where you're looking at the book and you're going to go, what? Silk pajamas? Silk shirts? The guy...
Toenail polish?
What's going on with this guy?
He was an interesting man. He at his ranch, he had this huge estate, and he had all sorts of wild animals roaming around the estate. It was sort of a hunting lodge. He loved these animals. They were, some of them, from Africa. he would have other Nazis come on, more or less state business, and he would descend from his bedroom in full, like, Holy Emperor gear. People just thought he was off his rocker, but he was very popular with the German public, and so it was hard for Hitler to sideline him until the very end.
Elementary question, why Nuremberg? Why not somewhere else?
Nuremberg had the most, even though Nuremberg itself was completely destroyed by the Allies, the old city of Nuremberg, this medieval, beautiful city, wiped out, 90% of it just leveled. One of the only pieces of infrastructure that was left was the prison and court system. So a lot of people think that Nuremberg was chosen because of the Nuremberg rallies, the symbolic value of holding a trial there where Hitler, Leni Riefenstahl filmed her movies of Hitler in this sort of godlike atmosphere with these worshipful soldiers. That was a side benefit. The symbolic value was sort of a side benefit to the very concrete notion that this city happened to have a large enough and intact prison attached to, and that was important too, attached to a courthouse.
The whole thing is so strange. These people commit these incredible atrocities. There was one of the prisoners, if I remember correctly, involved himself in experimentation with people to see how they'd react to malaria, and a whole bunch of people die. Was he one of the people that was close to Goering?
No, that was one of the doctors, one of the Nazi doctors, who was at one of the concentration camps where the second chaplain, who we haven't talked about yet, but Chaplain Sixtus O'Connor was the Catholic chaplain at Nuremberg. He was Gerecke's assistant. He liberated a concentration camp in Austria. And in that concentration camp, similar to other concentration camps in Auschwitz and other places, there were a lot of medical experiments. One of them was this man who did all sorts of, abominable stuff to people to try to figure out these, crazy medical schemes.
Tell us about the other chaplain that you just started to allude into. He's the Catholic chaplain, correct?
Yeah, Sixtus O'Connor was the Catholic chaplain. He was younger than Gerecke. He had a much different war. Gerecke spent his war before Nuremberg as a chaplain in an army hospital outside of London. So he was ministering both to doctors and nurses in this kind of almost MASH-like hospital, and also to the wounded who were coming in from the front lines. And then at the end of the war, his unit moved down into Germany and ended up in Munich, and that's where he was chosen. O'Connor was a Catholic priest, and he served with an infantry unit. And he and his unit were in the middle of battle. They were marching across Germany at the end, and it ended up in Austria. And he won a Bronze Star for bravery for ministering to people with what we now call PTSD, what used to be called battle fatigue, in the middle of battles. He was fluent in German, had been studying philosophy in Germany before the war started. His German was much better than Gerecke's, and they were the only two people, aside from the psychologist, the U.S. Army psychologist, who spoke German in the prison. But yeah, O'Connor he had fewer people to manage in terms of the Nazis in the prison, in Nuremberg prison, but some of the ones he had, Hans Frank, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, were among the sort of prototypical monster Nazis.
So picture this. Nuremberg is virtually destroyed. Yet we learn in this book that the United States invests a sizable amount of money to rebuild the palace to hold the trials. Was it over $1 million?
I think in today's, I can't remember the exact figure, but in today's figures, it would have been multiple millions of dollars. And a lot of it was to expand the courtroom. The courtroom is still there, and it's still being used as a regular municipal court in Germany. And you can go in, and it's tiny. You expect this huge, because of the importance of what the Nuremberg trials are, you expect this massive room, but it's very small. It's probably half the size of this auditorium. But they brought it back to that. During the time of the trials, they expanded it. They knocked holes in walls for cameras, for lights, for galleries, for the press. It was a big construction project for a few months in the months before. And also to sort of make it safe. The security of the Nuremberg trials was a massive issue.
These people were handcuffed, I guess, at times. They had guards standing right there. They were worried about these guys killing themselves or somebody else killing them. Do we know if there are any incidents that happened during the trials that disrupt the proceedings, or does anyone try to get to these people and say, you killed my family? Does that happen?
Not that I know of. It was one of the sort of major characters in the book is a man named Colonel Burton Andrus, and he is the commandant of the Nuremberg prison. He is Gerecke's boss, essentially, and he ran a very, very tight ship. His goal was to have a suicide-free trial. Within days, Robert Ley committed suicide, so right off the bat, he was not doing well. But he managed to, what Ley's suicide did was mean that every single, all 21 of the Nazis who were left had one of these white helmeted guards looking in on them through a peephole in their cell 24 hours a day. And these guys would take 2-hour shifts staring at the Nazis sleeping or reading a book or whatever they were doing. They were watched constantly from then on.
Yesterday, Dr. Johnson here was educating me on the uneasiness in the post-war era between the French, the English, the Americans, and the Russians. Not so much us and the English, but the French. When they pick the judges, what do we learn about that? Who are the judges and how are they selected? And is it weighted that the Americans and the Russians have more? Is it a panel? What do we know about it?
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things that I learned writing the book is how the Nuremberg trials came to be. They were very much an experiment. Nobody had ever done this kind of thing before. And so the architecture of the trials themselves were created essentially by FDR's lawyer sort of apparatus in New York. And this took months and months and months of wrangling and trying to come up with a system that was going to be amenable to all 4 of the allies who were going to conduct the trials. Eventually they settled on this structure, which it was unusual because it had never been done before. But the judges were made up of one judge and one alternate judge from each of those 4 countries. And then there were prosecution teams from each of those 4 countries. And they divided up the prosecution between the actual people and the idea of conspiracy, which was also unique to Nuremberg. It was something that they figured out would enable them to put the entire German system on trial if they also the SA could be guilty, the SD could be guilty. Each of those pieces of the apparatus of the German system could come under some sort of judgment if they tried them under this conspiracy charge. So each of the individual Nazis was on trial, but so was the entire system.
They had to build a scaffolding. They conducted the executions. I saw some of what you wrote at night, at odd times, 1 a.m.?
They built the scaffolding. There's so many books written, obviously, about this period of time, and so many written about very small corners of the story. One entire book was written by a man who was in charge of building the gallows. And he described how he had built some of the gallows at, I think it was Dachau, that there were also trials that were happening there concurrently. They brought these guys in. They built the Nuremberg gallows at Dachau, I think it was Dachau, and then took them apart, trucked them secretly to Nuremberg, spent, I think, 12 or 14 hours building them semi-secret back in the gymnasium in the prison at Nuremberg. So it's this very strange scene when the executions start happening and each prisoner is brought in and the gallows are next to basketball hoops.
Is there much debate as to whether they'll be shot, hung, or some other fashion destroyed?
Yeah, hanging was...
the Germans didn't want to be hung. They thought that was undignified?
They thought it was undignified, and I think they knew that it would be
Interesting
a
choice
horrific
coming from
death.
people who used other folks in an oven.
Well, right. I mean, how do you give them any say in how they're killed? And ultimately, the judges didn't give them a say. All of the requests to be
protested.
shot.
Didn't they protest?
Yeah,
Or
they had their attorneys write notes saying, "Please shoot me instead." Their wives sort of petitioned the court for some sort of mercy in that way, and the judges all said, "No deal."
It's a bit barbaric, but in the book, there is a short section that they actually contemplated. How long does it take for them to die? How do they die? When they are hanged? All of that.
Yeah.
So they had calculated that. They didn't want to let them off easily,
Right.
which is why they didn't want them to take the easy ride out by just, if they had cyanide, take the cyanide, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, they're hanging is a horrible way to die. It doesn't happen quickly. There are moments during the executions where there were two gallows. This person would drop through the floor. They'd bring the next person in. He would be hanged. Then everybody's just sitting around waiting because this guy, the first guy, still isn't dead. And so they would have to wait. That somebody would go take his pulse, finally take him down when he died. Then this guy's still dying. Then they bring this guy in. So there were these moments of horrible silence where everybody's just smoking cigarettes. All the witnesses, all the press, all the judges who are in there, all the guards, these white helmeted guards. There's just dead silence, and all you can hear is the creaking of the rope on the eye bolt.
And where is the major character while this is happening? Is he standing there? Is the Catholic chaplain giving last rites?
Yeah, the two
Some
chaplains.
of these people?
The two chaplains are really, I mean, sort of the main characters in motion during the executions. They're the ones who are going out back into the prison, collecting the next prisoner, walking back through the rain, through this courtyard in the rain, bringing them into these glaring lights of the gymnasium, walking with them as the prisoner is asked to say his name for the last time, then up the 13 steps to the top of the gallows. They say a prayer. The hood goes over, the noose goes over the neck, drops. Chaplains walk back out, do the same thing over and over again.
Are they all cremated or are some buried?
They're all cremated. It was a lot of, everything was done very secretively, and not a lot of this wasn't known until years and years later. But after all of the executions, the 11 bodies, including Göring, were put in a truck. There was all sorts of press around the prison. Two identical trucks took off and went in different directions, hoping that the press would follow the decoy truck. This truck had all sorts of gunners on top. Both of them had gunners on top to try to dissuade people from following. The truck ends up going to Munich, and the rumor was, for a long time, because it was written in one of the most famous Nuremberg history books, that the bodies were taken to Dachau, the ovens were fired back up, and their bodies were cremated in the same ovens that these Nazis had built.
Wow.
And then they were disposed of. That didn't happen. That was this sort of poetic ending that people thought made a nice story. Really, they were just taken to a crematorium in Munich. Their bodies were burned over the course of a day. They were put in these kind of metal casings, stored for the night in sort of a mansion that the American army had taken over. And in the morning, they were taken down to a creek. The remains were stomped on by some American soldiers into the creek, and they floated out into the sea.
I seem to have recalled reading something that said that in early 1945, when it looks like the war is about to end, Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill get together in their final meeting, and one of the issues they talk about is how they put these people out. And Roosevelt doesn't want to hang them, I think. I don't know what his thought was, but he ruled it out. Roosevelt dies April 12th. Shortly thereafter, Truman comes in and goes, yeah, well, that's not happening. And he allows the hanging to happen, right? He buys into what the others want.
There was a lot of debate about how this was going to happen. Because they were looking for the Allies toward the end, when they knew that they were going to win, they started thinking about how are we going to do this?
We don't want to glorify them. We don't want to make them into heroes or martyrs.
Right. So they started thinking about when they capture the Nazis who are going to be in hiding, what do they do? Do they just shoot them right away? Which is exactly what Churchill wanted to do. He was adamant that there's sort of a 10-minute show trial and then they're just shot. And the American lawyers working for FDR were horrified by this, and that's when they started coming up with the idea of a trial. There was still a lot of back and forth, but eventually this won out. The idea of a trial won out. But the Allies did, or the Americans did, a mock trial of Hitler, just in case.
And they were worried because, from what I gathered here, they said, what if we do get Hitler? He might get off. They were actually worried that he might not be convicted.
Well, I think what they thought was that it would give Hitler an opportunity to talk. It would give him a platform.
Make him a star.
Yeah. And so there was a huge concern that if he was caught and there was a trial and you tried to be fair about it, he might use that against them. And so it was another wrench in how they were going to do what they eventually did.
So has he tried in absentia or not?
No, he was gone. And so I think the way that they got around that was to this conspiracy charge. I mean, they sort of were putting the entire German system in the Third Reich on trial in that way.
We learned too that the Russians they captured people. When it was all over, the Germans were hoping we'd find them, because they knew if the Russians found them, it was going to be worse for them.
Right.
Does that ever come up in discussion? Oh, by the way, the Russians have about 200,000 of our people, and we don't know where they are. Does that come up?
There's a lot of talk, I think, about whether the Russians should even have been part of this Allied system in Nuremberg, because a lot of the defense attorneys for the defense, the Nazis' attorneys, frequently used the sort of Russian inhumanity as they were doing it, why aren't they on trial? And so I think the French and the English and the Americans, there was Nuremberg itself is an interesting community at that time, because the entire city is either starving or part of this, part of the actual mechanics of the legal mechanics and the sort of ripple effect of the hotels and the restaurants and the operas, and there was a
twisted economic advantage to Nuremberg. Like on weekends, there'd be parties and
VIPs would come in to see the trial, and they would be wined and dined. There were big parties at the prosecutor's house, at the judge's house. It was all the Americans were sort of in this area. They fraternized a little bit with the English. The French were sort of off by themselves because they didn't really want to be around anybody else, and nobody wanted to be around the Russians. So they were only they're only together in the courtroom, and then occasionally a friendship here and there. But it was a really interesting thing to know that Nuremberg was a party in a lot of ways. At night, when the trial was done, these were people who had won the war, but they weren't going home. So they had this year in this very confined space, and so yeah, they were drinking. They were going to, they set up an opera. They had movies come in. They had dances. Strange.
We're going to come to the audience for questions in a moment, but I also want to let our radio audience know, and anyone who has a device that may not want to ask their question, you can email a question to me and I'll pose it to Tim. You can send it to mark.bernier@erau.edu or use our traditional radio website at mark@marcberniershow.com. To get back to the chaplain, we'll go to questions in just a moment. So when the trial's ended and his work is done, he comes home. This is 1946, correct?
Yes.
Sometime late in 46. The trials actually begin in late 45?
Yeah, fall of 45 to fall of 46.
Okay, so over a year.
Yeah.
And he's gone for, what, 3 years?
He had been gone for, 3 years at that point.
What's his re-entry like when he comes back to the country?
He has a big party. The mayor of St. Louis has a party for him, and all of his friends come, and he's a little bit of a hero because he's performed this very strange task at Nuremberg, but he's still in the army, and so he comes home to St. Louis for a little bit, but then they move up to a disciplinary barracks in Milwaukee. So he's now ministering to American soldiers who are in this disciplinary barracks for the rest of his army career, which is another few years.
He's asked to give talks.
Yeah, and he does a lot of sort of talking on the women's club, the Lions Club, that kind of sort of small community speaking. He does that around the Midwest pretty frequently, and he tells his story in a way that is very much a story of evangelical Christianity and bringing the Christian faith back to people who probably it had long ago disappeared from their lives. And he and O'Connor were working against the clock in their view to try to save these souls. And so he tells that story in little towns all over the Midwest.
Now the big question, is he confused? Does he confuse people, and do they think that somehow he is a Nazi sympathizer because here he is ministering to these killers? And does this also affect you when you write the book? Do people think that somehow you're trying to soften the destruction by these people of others? First, tell us about Gerecke. Is he misunderstood, and does he have to keep clarifying what his mission was?
Yeah, he didn't really know that he was being misunderstood until he wrote his story in the Saturday Evening Post in 1952. He told essentially the story that he was telling in these little ROTC or these clubs around the Midwest. He told that in this national magazine, and he received hate mail, a lot of it, and it confused him. People called him a Nazi lover, an anti-Semite, and that had never occurred to him that was anybody could think that. He was very much, and I talk about this a lot in the book for this reason. I mean, he was a chaplain to all when he was a chaplain. So a lot of the Jewish doctors and nurses that he worked with during the war, he would often try to go find a rabbi for them in anywhere they were. He wanted people to worship in whatever tradition they had,
That
but he
impressed
wanted
me.
them.
He sought out rabbis. That was outside of his parameters, but he did because he thought they should be connected to their faith.
Yeah, that was the important part to him. And there's a story I tell in the book about one nurse in particular who so appreciated this about him, that he was really, especially during the high holidays, he really tried to find rabbis for the Jewish doctors and nurses. And she thought this was great. Her dad was a jeweler in New York and made a ring for him that had a motto that he said all the time, "This too shall pass." He said that all the time during the war, and she made him this ring and gave it to him. And he wore it for the rest of his life. When he died, his son wore the ring, and it doesn't fit him anymore, so his granddaughter now wears it around her neck. It was important to him, and that kind of thing is why he was sort of taken aback by by a lot of this hate mail that he got.
Now when you came to your publishers with this and the book comes out, are you misunderstood?
Well, there's an element, I mean, as a journalist, it's easy for me to kind of take a step back and say, I'm just telling a story. But yeah, I mean, I think there is, among people who, it's a very hard thing to understand what these two men did. First of all, that the Allies decided to provide spiritual comfort to these Nazis while they're on trial for crimes against humanity. That's a huge step. Why did we do that? The answer is the Geneva Convention. But these two men did something that we had never asked of chaplains before, which was to minister to the enemy. And it was, for them, not just something that their country was asking them to do, but because they were pastors, they felt that this was their religious mission as well, that they really needed to try to bring these men back from some sort of darkness into their own light. And that's so difficult for me to understand, just as how many of us could have gone into a cell with Hitler's number 2 and kneeled down on the cement floor and prayed with him?
Yeah, Goering never buys into it, says, hey, thanks for coming, but no thanks. Some of these people take communion before they die. They actually become Christians?
Yeah, that was their goal. That was the two chaplains. That's really what they wanted. And yet, as I said, they knew that they were in a race against time. No one knew how long the Nuremberg trials were going to last. Some people thought they might be 3 weeks long. Some people thought 3 months. Nobody really thought a year. So they had a clock in front of them before the gallows were going to be wheeled in. And yet, they also both took a lot of time to kind of re-catechize these men. So they both had their kind of phony antennas up. They knew that some people would just come in and say, maybe just out of fear, whatever I believe, whatever you want me to believe, just let me know that I'm not going to hell. So they took a long time to sort of retrain these people in Christianity, and they believed, both chaplains believed, that they had been successful with a few.
Okay. When they come back to the United States, do the two chaplains ever connect, or they go their separate ways?
No, they actually tried once to reconnect, and when one of them was crossing the country. But Gerecke went back. Eventually, he made his way back to sort of central Midwest, and ends up in Chester, Illinois, right on the other side of the Mississippi River. And Chaplain O'Connor goes back to upstate New York, where he was from, and becomes a philosophy professor and teacher. And I think it must have been when O'Connor was traveling across country at one point, he was going to stop by and see Gerecke, but it never happened for some reason.
He ends up getting a church to sort of take you to the conclusion. He lives more than 20 years after, right? Yeah. And runs into the same problem that pastors worldwide run into. Not enough money to run the church. And he admonishes them, because, hey, nobody's giving. And then he thinks about it and he says, it needs to be from the heart. And he doesn't want them to feel guilted into doing it. It's a very complex situation. He never gets wealthy, does he?
No, God, no.
He doesn't make any money from this.
He doesn't make any money, and yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of what he did during the Depression was the same thing. He was always couldn't understand why people wouldn't give money to the church that was going to do good things with it. He just couldn't figure it out. Even during the Depression, nobody had any money. So yeah, he continues that effort when he has this. He's an assistant pastor at this little Lutheran church in Illinois, but the real reason he moved to this to this little town in Chester is because it's the home of a major penitentiary.
Okay.
And so he moves there to become the chaplain for
more killers,
people on
more
death row.
criminals.
Yeah. So he spends the last years of his life ministering again to people who have committed murder and rape and the worst of the worst.
Then he dies in the 60s. He was in his car? Is that how he died?
Yeah, he was on his way to a Bible study at the prison, has a heart attack in the parking lot, drives himself home, and his wife puts him on the couch and goes across the hospital's literally across the street from his house, tiny little town hospital, and just amazingly, this is 1961. They say, just bring him over, walk him over. And they do. She walks him over. They put him in a room or on a bed or something, and Alma goes out to call their kids, and when she comes back, he's gone.
So they have a service for him, and the prisoners from this penitentiary, killers, the worst type of people, all come, and they're crying, right?
Yeah, the warden, they ask the warden if he will ask the family if Gerecke's body can be brought back up to the prison, which, has never, they say in these articles that were written about it that nobody could figure out if that had ever been done before. So the family says yes, and hundreds of these prisoners file past his casket, and then at the end give an envelope to the family to put a cross on top of the church that would be lit up in honor of Gerecke, which is still there. The Gerecke cross is on that school next to the church still.
Does the Post-Dispatch run excerpts from your book when it comes out or during the time?
They did. They ran an excerpt of the book, which was very nice of them, and and they gave it a nice review.
He lives now in Washington with the Pew Research Center. We're going to come to questions now from the audience, and Kyle has a microphone, Alyssa has a microphone. We're going to go left to right. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tim. Albert Speer was one of the characters, one of the war criminals who never got executed. He actually served, I think, 25 years, and through that, we learn a lot from his memoirs. We get a lot of inside look of what was going on in Hitler's regime. Does Gerecke have any contact at all with Speer, and are there others like Speer that maybe we get a lot of information from and learn some more history about the inner circle of Hitler?
Yeah, great question. Yes, Speer was one of Gerecke's congregation, and Gerecke felt that Speer, among his group of Protestants, was one of the men that he felt had come back to the church. Speer did not write about Gerecke in either of his books, and so it's an interesting, how people remember things or portray things. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what the truth is, but maybe it was that Speer didn't, want to sort of give that part of himself in his books. Maybe Gerecke felt that his impression on Speer was bigger than it actually was. But yes, he was part of the group that Gerecke felt that he had connected with, and in fact, a couple of different parts of the book I relate back to the beginning of Speer's second book, because it's a really good description of what happened right at the executions. But a couple of the other, Fritzsche wrote a book that talks about Gerecke a lot. He was the radio propaganda chief. Fritzsche, Hans Fritzsche, yeah. And I think a couple other ones mention him briefly. Emma Goring writes about Gerecke in her book, Goring's wife, and a couple other places I found his name mentioned.
He was on the radio, too. He had a radio program, Mr. Gerecke.
He did. Moments of Comfort was his radio show on KFMU. It's the Lutheran radio station.
Public radio station?
Well, it was the Lutheran radio. It still is the Lutheran radio station in St. Louis, and his voice had this very He had a great radio voice, and they tried to poach him at the big radio station in St. Louis, but he thought it wasn't going to let him do the sort of religion thing as much as he could.
Let's come back over here. I'm looking for Alyssa. Where is she? Here we go. Okay. Well, whoever has a question, here goes Kyle up here.
I had a question about the German generals, Jodl, Keitel, and even Goering, too. One of their defense really was, I was just following orders, I'm a professional soldier, which they truly were. They weren't the Gestapo or Himmler, who incidentally did commit suicide, too. But I know there was some sympathy from what I don't know if that's the proper word, from other American military leaders for these people, particularly Jodl. And I just wondered how Gerecke addressed that. It must have come up in conversations or something that they did. They had a long, illustrious history in the military from World War I, you know.
Right, right. That's true. And it's for a long time, and you're right, a lot of Allied military spoke up in defense of some of the generals who, as you said, they weren't Himmler. But I think a lot of the Nuremberg, you know, Jodl and Keitel were both executed. Donitz was in there too, the naval admiral. But it seemed that in the trials, that really was their defense. That, you know, we were military guys. We did exactly what you guys did. But Keitel, in particular, was, you know, he was a lickspittle with Hitler. I mean, he did whatever Hitler wanted him to do, and that was sort of how the Nuremberg. That was the evidence that was sort of prepared by the prosecution at Nuremberg. Keitel and Gerecke were very close. Keitel was another one who Gerecke believed had been brought back to the church, and they were almost the same age. They had sons that were about the same age. They were from the same part of Germany. Their moms taught them the same lullabies when they were growing up. So they had a lot in common, and they were very close. And Keitel was the second person that Gerecke brought into the execution chamber.
Back over here, Dr. Lynn Indiana joins us tonight with his question.
Yes, I have a couple questions for you, very simple questions. You alluded at the beginning about the courthouse itself. We were there last year, and there were groups of people coming there wanting to see the actual place in the courthouse where the trials took place. And they told us that this was still a civil court and it was in use and we couldn't get to see it. There were so many disappointed people. Why are they keeping this as a regular courthouse when this is obviously one of the most famous buildings post-war Europe? And the second question I have for you is the movie Judgment at Nuremberg. How accurate do you think this was done?
Really good questions. Again, I think, you know, when I spent a lot of time in Nuremberg when I was writing this, and Nuremberg has had a very complicated relationship with its history. Not just its Nazi history. It was sort of the center of rabid anti-Semitism going back to the Middle Ages. Nuremberg, the Nazi Nuremberg obviously has this kind of symbolic value, as I was talking about before, because of the Nuremberg rallies. And it's only really in recent years that it has embraced its sort of place in history. They've now built a really amazing, they call it the Documentation Center, but they've built it. Speer was building these incredible monuments in Nuremberg, and one of them was it was going to be the Nazi kind of parliament. It looked like the Colosseum in Rome. It was only about half built. As part of that, it's this amazing architectural thing. It's like a dart or an arrow that's been built through this Colosseum, where they've told the story of the Nazis at Nuremberg. And so that's been around for about 10 or 15 years, and only in the last 3 years they opened up, or 2 years even, they opened up something right above the courthouse. So right above the courtroom, I don't know if you saw it, but it was related. It was, you know, a museum type of thing, and it tells the story of the trials. And they have little windows so you can look down at the courtroom itself. So they're now they're starting to sort of embrace the fact that people really do want to know and want to learn about their city and what it has to do with this important piece of history. And in terms of judgment at Nuremberg, that is about a subsequent trial. That is about the first the judges. I think it was about the trial of the judges. And so that judgment at Nuremberg is not about this first trial, the trial of the major war criminals.
We're going to take questions. We'll go back and forth here. Anyone here on this side before I come back over here? I'm sorry? Go ahead, Kyle.
My only question for you, Tim, is how much remorse did a lot of these war criminals actually show during the trial? Because I know some of them didn't show any remorse at all, but I know there were some also that showed that they knew they did something wrong, but they were doing it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. There was a very wide spectrum of, nobody in the end owned up to what they did, really. The people who came the closest probably were Speer. He was just probably the most honest about what he had done and his part in it. He also had some cover because he had actually taken part in an attempt to kill Hitler at one point. There were others like Hans Frank, who was, his nickname is the Butcher of Krakow. He was a horrible person. I actually met with his son in Germany when I was doing the book. He came very close during his defense to taking a little bit of ownership over what he had done and saying that he had done something wrong. But in his final statement, probably because Göring got to him in the meantime, he took it all back and said, I wasn't responsible.
What do we know about Gerecke's wife afterwards? How much longer does she live? He dies in 1961. He's 68 years old, I think.
That's right.
What's the rest of her life like?
She lives a very simple life in Chester, Illinois. She died, I think, 12. I don't remember exactly, but a decent amount of time later. He was a young man when he died. She was younger than he was anyway, and lived a few years more than he did. So, but she had a very simple life. The town really embraced the Gereckes, Chester, and their house is right there, and people know it and say that's the Gerecke house. So yeah, they were. The kids were also Army kids. The Gerecke's children, Hank, Corky, and Roy, were all career Army people. So they also took her, in when she was getting elderly.
Are the Gereckes satisfied with the way the story has been told in the book?
Thank God, yes. Yeah, it was really, that was the most nerve-wracking part of this entire many-year-long process, was giving this book to Hank when it was just paper and saying,
What do you think?
And he said, love it.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write it?
From the time I found it that day I was doing the reporting until it came out was about 6 years.
Wow. In the audience now, your question. Good evening. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you. Did the Nazis come into this trial as religious people, or were they agnostic, or?
Good question.
Yeah, great question. They were all over the map, really. I mean, most of them had Christianity sort of beaten out of them as Nazis. The Hitler and the Nazis and the Reich had a very sort of skewed view of Christianity. It really wasn't Christianity. It was more sort of this monotheistic or Christless version of Christianity. And so a lot of them were believers in that kind of thing, but they had also, most of them, been baptized in some way as either Lutherans or Catholics. And so that was part of what the two chaplains were trying to do, is sort of unearth what these men had known as children in terms of their religious life.
They were allowed to not exercise every day, but they could walk, and I think you describe it as, is it 100 yards or 100 feet? It's an area that they go back and forth. Sometimes they gather as a group, sometimes they just walk by themselves. Right?
Yeah, there was a little courtyard outside of the prison, and they were allowed out there for, I think, half an hour a day or something like that, and they weren't supposed to walk together, but, you know, at some points the guards just, you know, let them do it after a while, and so they would walk in these sort of little rectangles back and forth.
Were they being inspected from a health standpoint? Was there an independent body that was checking to make sure they weren't being abused and that they were actually getting food?
I don't think it was that official. I mean, there was a German doctor and an American Army doctor, both of whom were assigned to the prison. So if anybody, you know, got a cold or something, they were taken care of. But I don't think a Red Cross person was coming in and making sure everything was okay.
Looking for questions from the audience. Anybody, if you raise your hand, we'll come to you before we conclude tonight, because I have still questions for them, but I want to give you all a chance. In the middle, I don't know if we can get to you, but maybe you can shout out your question. Go ahead, sir.
I was wondering, how did the two chaplains get selected? Did they volunteer for this, or were they were the next ones up? What were they with that?
Yeah,
For the radio audience, how were the chaplains selected?
that was one of the big pieces that I wanted to know too. And it's sort of fascinating. It's much simpler than I would have imagined. They were nearby, and they spoke German. I mean, the selection of people to take part in Nuremberg was extraordinary anyway, because everyone wanted to go home. The war was over. Everybody wanted to go home. And so, yeah, both Gerecke and O'Connor were, O'Connor had just come down from Austria, where he had liberated Mauthausen concentration camp. He was actually brought in first, and the first Lutheran chaplain that they tried was a young guy in his 20s, also spoke German, but the Nazis wouldn't talk to him because he was 26, and they just didn't, they weren't going to talk to him. So Burton Andrus, the commandant, heard about Gerecke, who was working in a hospital in Munich at the time, heard that he had, he's a Lutheran, he spoke German, and he had worked in the St. Louis City jail system as part of his missionary work when he was during the Depression. And so Andrus went after Gerecke hard. Gerecke was given the option by his commanding officer whether he wanted to take the assignment or go home. And he took it, obviously.
Tim, do we know, because very little information from the trials goes out, does the American press cover this as a story, or do they not?
It's so interesting. They don't cover it as a story because, the drama of Nuremberg is probably sucking all the life out of the room in terms of story. But here and there you can see, like around Christmas, there are stories mentioning Gerecke and O'Connor because the press want to ask them, what did the Nazis do during Christmas? Did they celebrate Christmas? Same thing during the executions. They wanted to know, what did the chaplains think, or are they at peace with God, kind of questions. But those are the only two times that I found any clippings about the chaplains.
In the audience, good evening.
At the beginning, you said, you talked about the letter that the 21 signed writing to his wife. How did they come about to get together to write that letter since they weren't allowed to interact with each other?
They signed it. They had the idea to write it, I think it was Fritzsche. Fritzsche was the propaganda guy, and he was a good writer. He wrote it, and Baldur von Schirach, who was the Hitler Youth leader, he spoke English because his mother was American. He translated it from German into English, The Germans passed it around in the dock one day when one of them was, on the stand, and read it. They all signed it. Von Schirach translated it into English, and then they got it through one of their attorneys to get out through the system. It had to be okayed by the Allies, but yeah, it was just sort of. And in fact, I shouldn't make it sound like they never got together. During lunches, during breaks in the courtroom, you can see some of the videos during any of these breaks. There were a lot of breaks in the court appearance because everything had to be translated into 4 languages. And the translation, this is the first time anybody had done something that complicated. And so everything's broke. Translators disappeared. They needed to. So apparently it was an incredibly monotonous trial. It was very, very boring. And you can see a lot of times if you watch YouTube, there are YouTube videos up now of the interactions. And, people are talking to each other. And so I think it was a fairly common thing that they could just sort of hang out.
And it also appears, too, that because this thing goes on so long, they have security, you have the community, the whole thing is bizarre. And then there's the overlap with the Japanese trials, which is, but one thing I found was missing. Israel doesn't really come into existence yet as we know it. They don't have a seat at the table, yet all these atrocities against Jewish people, they don't get to weigh in, do they?
No. No, and a lot of people I've talked to now have said, wouldn't it have been interesting if the Jewish community in some way, whatever that would have been, could have weighed in, could have said, maybe that's not such a good idea to have these men providing spiritual comfort to the architects of the Holocaust. Maybe we should rethink that, at least how it looks, even. But no, there was nothing like that. It was a military decision.
Guantanamo is a long way from Nuremberg, isn't it? Just think of this, you know. Some of these people almost become celebrities if we don't hold them in check today.
It's an amazing thing. I actually was thinking about doing this when I was, the first version of this book, I was going to be doing a lot of journalism that was sort of attached to some of the big themes of the book. And one of the trips I wanted to make was to Guantanamo to talk to the chaplains there to see how that works. It's totally different because they essentially allow the inmates at Guantanamo to preach to each other. It's not like there is an American chaplain down there, but the responsibilities of that chaplain are to make sure that they have the right prayer books and that kind of thing.
Jim Purdy is a public defender, and a good friend of ours attended many of these. He has a question from the audience.
Yes, several of the people that were on trial were executed, but others served long prison sentences, and some did get out. Were you able to find any record that those that survived the Nuremberg trials and were sentenced to prison ever went on to lead Christian lives as a result of this?
Great question. There was a pamphlet that came out by an English evangelical pastor in the 1980s, and it was about Gerecke. It's called The Sword and the Cross. It's very directed at Christians. The Gerecke story, very thin. Grossmith is the author. He went to Germany and found Speer to talk to him about Gerecke, and claims that in that conversation, Speer said that Gerecke had changed his life and he had become a Christian, and that his Christian faith directed him in Spandau and after he got out. Because of the way the pamphlet was written, I didn't include that in the book because it felt I couldn't ask Speer anymore if that conversation had happened, and the pamphlet was for a very direct. As a journalist, it made me feel uncomfortable using it as a direct source. But obviously, it's possible that it did happen, and I think Gerecke would have been thrilled if that was true.
Do we know now if there was ever any discussion or debate about moving the hearings out of Germany and bringing them somewhere else, The Hague or Belgium or London? Was there ever any discussion about that?
I don't think so, although I shouldn't say that because there was discussion about everything. I think everything was up for debate because it was new. I don't think so because I think they wanted this trial to be, sort of among the German people. They wanted it to be important to Germany as well as the rest of the world. So I think it was always going to be in Germany. It was just a matter of, I think it was going to be in Berlin for a little bit, and then I think because they found this structure, the prison and courthouse.
I have a source who told me this, and I haven't been able to confirm this. He knew I was reading your book. He said, ask Tim if he knows anything about this. Supposedly, countries that didn't get involved in the war wanted in on Nuremberg. Spain and one other country. And we told them, scram. You guys didn't help us. You sat this one out. You don't get in. The reason that he's told me to ask you this, first, can you answer that? Do you know anything about that?
I don't.
Okay. The Russians declared war on the Japanese after we dropped at least the first bomb so they could sit at the table to divvy up the spoils. The belief is the Russians only came into this after being dragged in, even though they had been invaded, because they wanted to have
some say in what happened.
Yeah. Did you find that with Nuremberg, that the Russians were not really wanted to be in this, but the Russians insisted they be in this?
I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how the sort of machinations of how each country felt about the other at that point when they were trying to figure out. But as I said, this was an American-driven event. The entire premise of this was built and dreamed up by American lawyers. And I spend some amount of time in the book describing that process because I just think it's interesting. I didn't know how, you sort of think of the Nuremberg trials as this already formed event, but it actually came from nothing. They had to sort of scratch and throw a lot of ideas at the wall and see what stuck. And it really was lawyers in New York created it, figured it out. And then it was the prosecutor, the American prosecutor, who was, oh my God, I'm going to forget his name. Thank you, Jackson, drove the train completely. And he gave one of the most famous speeches in the history of jurisprudence to open the trial. And it was very much a Jackson event.
It's interesting that we talked with Scott Berg, a prolific author who wrote the book about Wilson at the beginning of the year. And it's interesting how history follows, and you'll read it in this book, that when they were trying to form the League of Nations, France, England, and the United States, with Wilson as the cornerstone, says, let's figure out what we're going to do to try these people when it's over. And France stepped in and said, well, we already got plans for these guys. Nothing happens after this. They don't get off their knees after this. Mm-hmm. And they shot down the idea of having trials. And then, in the audience, we're looking for anyone before we close out. I've got time for one more question from way over here. Let's see if we can come to you, ma'am.
Did you get a sense that in all of this planning that was legal in its inception had anything to do with helping the German people as a whole to heal and because they really didn't have any responsibility for this and couldn't have prevented it, as I know history. So was this intended in some way to help them heal and become a nation again?
That's an excellent question.
But having the trial in the country had to be part of that healing.
Are they taken into consideration as the questioner asked?
I think that, as we were saying before, I think having the trial in Germany was important for that reason. And, part of it was to show, I think, that we, the Allies, were interested in justice and that we were going to take the high road. Obviously, we could have just shot all 21 of these guys and been done with it and moved on. But I think it was important for the Allies to show the German people in Germany, this is what civilized society is. You let people stand up for or try to take account for what they did. And by the way, 3 of them walked away from the trials, were declared innocent and walked out of the jail. So I think that was symbolically probably very important, yeah. Very good point.
And we want to remind you that Tim will be signing copies of the book Mission at Nuremberg coming up in just a moment. So as soon as we conclude, we'll let Tim come over to the table. Our partners from the Embry-Riddle bookstore would be very happy to sell you a copy of the book tonight. It's a fabulous read, and it's a must-read. I want to thank Alyssa and Kyle, who gave up their time to be with us tonight, and Mike, you from the audience. Chivalry, who came back to shoot video tonight, thanks so much. Bob Score lent him to us. To Tony Petro and his staff up above, who lit and carried this on so that we could conduct this program tonight. And back at the WNDB studios, John Warb, who ran the controls so that we could get this on the radio. There will be an encore coming up a week from Saturday. It will also be on the Roku channel in over 10 million homes. Let's talk about our next event that's coming up, our final one for 2014. Major Michael Banzet will discuss his book, A Flower Shop in Baghdad, the rebuilding of the Iraqi Air Force. And you'll get to ask him a question about ISIS. That's coming up in 2 weeks, right here. Book signing immediately follows the interview. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a wonderful applause for our wonderful guest tonight, Tim Townsend. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Have a very pleasant good evening.